Yo, what's up, J-Dog?
Yo, Big D, what's up going on?
You're not gonna believe this, man.
What, man? Tell me.
I've only become a rapper.
A rapper? Why?
Well, we've left the EU, haven't we?
Yeah, but what's that mean?
Let me tell you what that means. Put on my socks and I couldn't find my shoes. That's what happens when we leave the EU. Went to McDonald's, it had no drive-through. That's what happens when you leave the EU. Ordered a cheeseburger, they gave me two. That's what happens when you leave the EU. Planted a tree and it still hasn't grew. That's what happens when you leave the EU. A t-shirt was green and now look it's blue. That's what happens when you leave the EU. I tried to tell a lie and it turned out true. That's what happens when you leave the EU. Can't take my daughter to the zoo. That's what happens when you leave the EU. Cats go meow but cows don't moo. That's what happens when you leave the EU. Got my wisdom teeth out and now I can't chew. That's what happens when you leave the EU. Bought a boat yesterday but I got no crew. That's what happens when you leave the EU. We've got a lot of problems and we'll give you a clue. They all started happening when we left the EU.
Oh! You mean to tell me all of that stuff's gonna happen?
Not only that, man, there's so much more.
What do you mean so much more? What else?
Well, I got a little list for you
A
here.
list? How long's the list?
It's pretty long, man. Listen up.
Go on then.
Cold winters,
Brexit.
splinters,
Brexit.
traffic lights,
Brexit.
street fights,
Brexit.
potholes,
Brexit.
Beyonce knows,
Brexit.
paying bills,
Brexit.
landfills,
Brexit.
being late,
Brexit.
Windows 8.
Brexit.
What is going on here?
Brexit! Right then, Big D. I think I know how to handle this.
You sure, J-Dog?
Yeah, man, I got this. I've got some problems of my own.
Okay, man.
David Cameron. Who? That's what happens when you leave the EU. I went to church but I couldn't find a pew. That's what happens when you leave the EU. I played Pokemon, I couldn't catch Mewtwo. That's what happens when you leave the EU. I've got no milk so I can't have a brew. That's what happens when you leave the EU. I went to the post office, there was no queue. That's what happens when you leave the EU. Hugh Jackman is my favorite Hugh. That's what happens when you leave the EU. Everybody will now get swine flu. That's what happens when you leave the EU. My favorite cocktail is a strawberry woo woo. That's what happens when you leave the EU. I've got no beef to put in my stew. That's what happens when you leave the EU. All these problems, old and new, they all began when we left the EU. That it?
Yeah, James?
I think I'm gonna go home now.
Yeah, I'm not proud of that.
See you in a bit.
Bye.